Alright, how's it going, y'all? So today I'm excited because ZimaBoard has sponsored this tutorial onto how to add hardware transcoding for Plex or like MB or Jellyfin to any Synology NAS by just adding on one of their boxes. So ZimaBoard sponsored this tutorial, thanks to them. I actually came up with it and it's a video I've been wanting to make for a while, and it ended up just working out quite well that they were offering to sponsor it. But what ZimaBoard is it's kind of like a Raspberry Pi just on steroids. And for this video, one critical thing that it has is a Intel CPU with Intel QuickSync. And that can solve a ton of people's problems. Because when the DS923 generation came out, Synology switched from Intel to AMD for their CPUs. And in my experience, the AMD CPUs are a good bit faster and more performant for pretty much all tasks except for one thing: transcoding a video in something like Plex. Because AMD does not have a compatible GPU built into the CPU that can be used in Plex. They do have one that is similar, but Plex does not work with it, at least as the time they're recording this video. So this right here is that perfect add-on where you can just essentially run Plex on this device while using your NAS for storage. And this can actually kill two birds with one stone. Not only are you just going to get better performance out of hardware transcoding than software transcoding, you're also going to be offloading all that processing to a separate device than your NAS. And so if you've got a busy file server and you don't want the entire thing to grind to a halt because one person's transcoding a video in Plex, it's perfect. You can offload all that functionality to this device and have hardware transcoding built in. They have three different models, a 2, 4, and an 8 gig model with a slightly different CPU in them, but all three of those models have the same Intel QuickSync GPU in them. So for this, they all should perform essentially the same. Plex does probably want more than 2 gigs of RAM, so it may be worth it to upgrade to the 4 gig model. This is the 8 gig model, but in reality, you should very much be able to get almost the same, if not identical performance out of the 2 gig version of this, which is currently, at the time of recording, about $120 US. They also do seem to have a board coming out that is much cheaper, that still does seem to have Intel QuickSync on it, so I'm very interested to see that when it does come out. All right, so this is not going to be much of an unboxing or anything. We're just going to go ahead and start setting this thing on up and pulling it out. All right, so this right here is the ZimaBoard, and it's actually got a couple of cool things on it. It's got 2 gigabit Ethernet ports, which is huge. And so for this video, we're only going to be using one of those. But if you wanted to, you could also actually use the other one to be plugged directly into the back of the Synology and build a direct connection in between the two units. So any kind of networking stuff this is doing and pulling from the Synology would not be affecting any of the other throughput on the Synology. You could do that. You could also set up with NFS, really whatever you'd like to do. But for this, we just are going to be using the one because in general, you can get away with pretty much anything with a 1 gigabit connection with Plex. I've never really seen a server that needs more than that, and anything that would need more than that would absolutely nuke this machine. And if you also don't have a Synology, you could also just use the multiple SATA ports in the back to just add your own hard drives, or even the PCIe Express slot to do whatever you want to. It's a pretty cool board. It's really designed for tinkering, like truly Raspberry Pi on steroids. But all we're actually going to do is plug in one of these into my network and turn it on. And that's pretty much going to be it. And I'm going to go ahead and log into my computer. All right, so I've just powered it on, and we're actually going to be configuring this all via SSH. If you've never used SSH before, on macOS and on Windows, you can both open up PowerShell for Windows, Terminal for macOS, and just SSH on in. And so for this, we're actually just going to use the default username and password SSH on in, which is enabled by default. And it also has the host name called Casa OS, which is what ZimaBoard runs. So we're just going to SSH using SSH Casa OS as the username at casaos.local as the IP address. And then the password is Casa OS. So username, password, and hostname by default are all Casa OS, all lowercase. The very first thing we want to go ahead and do is look at what the date is. So my date is correct. If not, make sure yours is as well. And we're actually just going to go ahead and follow a pretty basic guide on how to install Plex on Debian. So what we're going to do is we're just going to follow this guide. We are a Debian-based distribution. I will leave a link down in the description below for this. And we are just going to echo this right here by saying sudo echo. And what this is going to do is this is just going to add the signature for the Plex Media server into our distribution. And now we are going to add in the key. Now it has been added on in there, so we're going to do a sudo apt update to update our packages, especially it's been a while, so it is not a big deal. And so now doing our sudo apt update, we're just going to do a sudo apt install Plex Media Server. And let that go ahead and install. Now, one other thing I did want to mention is this is actually a rule for Plex. If you're using something like Jellyfin or Emby, you don't have the same limitation. But if you do want to use Plex Media Server and hardware transcoding, that is required for you to have a Plex pass. All right, so we have just installed Plex Media Server on here. So now we should be able to just go to Casa OS and the port and be able to get in there. Just to confirm that is working, we're going to do a sudo system control status Plex Media Server. All right, so now that we know that Plex Media Server is successfully running, we can actually just log straight into it using our web browser. We are just going to go to casaos.local :32400, that's the port, /web. So casaos.local and then :32400/web. And this is now Plex installed on our device. So just sign in with your Plex account. And we're just going to set this up as a Plex Media Server. For now, skip the media library because that is going to be in the next step. And now we are bare bones signed in. We can look at ZimaBoard demo. And the first thing we want to go ahead and do is enable our actual hardware transcoding when available. So we're going to say yes, use hardware transcoding when available. All right. So now we have successfully installed Plex on our ZimaBoard. The next thing we want to go ahead and do is we want to go ahead and set up our Synology to actually be the media folder for the ZimaBoard. And so I've got a DS923 behind me, and we're going to go ahead and set that up. So I'm going to go ahead and log into my NAS. And the first thing we want to go ahead and do is create an account just for this ZimaBoard for being able to actually just access this one media folder. And we're just going to generate it a password. So the first thing we're going to go ahead and do, if you've not already created a shared folder where your media is, go ahead and create one of those. And now we're also going to go in and we're going to create a new user who only has access to that. I'm going to call it Plex Zima. And we're just going to generate a random password and copy that on in there. It's really more like just a access token than a password because it's really just going to be used for this one connection. We are only going to give them access to the media file, and this is your option if you want to give it read-write or read-only. I'm going to give it read-write because that will allow Plex to actually delete media as required and will also allow us to offload some additional functionality. You can also deny from some random stuff if you wanted to. The important thing is we're going to be mounting over SMB, which is going to give us a solid connection there. All right, so now we've created this Plex Zima user. Now all we have to do is go ahead and mount this drive, and we're going to set up to mount on boot. So we're going to be mounting the SMB shared folder of media onto our actual ZimaBoard every time it boots up. And then Plex on the ZimaBoard is going to read that media and use that to actually be our media server. So we're going to go back in and we are going to make sure that we've got a couple of things installed. So we're going to do a sudo apt install CIFS utilities. It comes preloaded, but just in case, also add tools. And you can safely say yes to everything. All right, so now we are going to be able to go ahead and mount this drive on boot. So to do that, we're going to be using the fstab file, and this is where we're going to be doing a bit of text editing. The first thing we need to do is go into root, and we're going to see that by default there is this mnt folder, and so we're going to cd into that, and we're going to create a new directory in there with a sudo mkdir We're going to call it Plex Media. And we're going to change the permission to this Plex Media directory to 777, which is normally something you do not want to do. But in this case, we want any other apps and packages we're installing on the Zima board to be able to access our media. So if you add apps to transcode stuff or anything like that, you're going to be able to just have everything access the media on it very easily. It is not sensitive stuff, it is your media. And so it is a safe thing to do in this case. If you are more apt with Linux, you can also go ahead and start adding groups and making sure that only specific package groups have access to the Plex Media directory. But for novices getting started, this is something that is safe to do because it only has access to the media on the Synology. So we are going to do a sudo chmod plus 777 to Plex Media. We are going to go ahead and see that there is a folder here called Plex Media, and nothing's in it right now. All right, so now we want this Plex Media folder right here to be populated with the one that is on our NAS. And we're going to do that by editing the fstab file with a sudo nano etc/fstab. Do not touch either one of these, and we're going to add another comment here as a separate one down at the bottom. So the way we're going to do this is we are going to do / the IP address or the host name of the NAS. So for me, it's nas1.local. If you have a static IP address on your local network for the NAS, you can put that here. And then / the folder name media or whatever you've called it. So this is what's on the NAS. And now where do we want to put it? Well, we want to put it at mnt/plex media, that folder we just created. Now we're going to say CIFS for the file type, and now some special permissions. So normally you would not want to have the password directly in this file because it'd be plain text readable by anybody. But once again, this is for basics where we're just getting started out. And this user only has access to this media folder on the NAS, and everybody on the Zima board, we want to have access to the media as well. So this is nothing to worry about. But as you get better, you can also add it as a hidden file and things like that. That only root can read it. And so that's a little bit more secure. But for this case, we're doing it much simpler and it's not a security issue. So we're just going to say username, that username we came up with on our NAS over here, which for me was plex-zima. And then comma password equals, and then whatever password you set up. So I'm just pasting mine back in, and comma, a couple of other pieces here. We're going to do ISO char set. This is just something that can make it more compatible if you're using non-standard characters in any file names, kind of the additional set. So we were just going to paste that in there as well. And now we're going to add a 0 and a 0 at the end. So hopefully we did everything right. Let me go ahead and shrink this on down so you can see everything. All right, so now what we should have is the IP of the NAS and the folder we're mounting, or the host name, I call it NAS1, the place we're mounting it to on the Zima board, CIFS, the protocol we're using, the username and password we set up for Synology, and then 00 at the end with IO char set UTF-8. And now we're going to do Control X to exit, Y to save, or Enter to write it. And we're going to do a sudo mount-a. All right, so we did not get an error. I got an error last time. And so if we go into Plex Media, we should see the demo movies. All right, perfect. All right, so right here, we are able to see all the files directly in here. And so that means that the Plex is going to be able to see it. So we should be able to do a sudo reboot. And assuming I know what I'm doing, this should mount exactly the same as soon as we reboot. So that means that this is just going to work eternally, and we can hook up Plex to just manage this directly. And we're pretty much going to be done after this. All right, so a quick dumb debug later. I accidentally had my backslashes as forward slashes or my forward slashes backslashes because, well, Linux and Windows cannot figure out which one they want to use for that, but it should be // It was very odd. It was working with a sudo mount during the file system was up, but it would not mount on reboot. Long story short, I also added file mode and dir mode to 777. I will leave a link to this down in the description below, probably on my forum site, that has all of this that you need. And when we do a reboot, it does successfully work now just fine. One of those dumb things that takes forever to debug, and finally got it, which was just a huge pain. All right, so now that you've got this done, you should reboot it and be able to just see that the movies are there. Perfect. Now the last thing we have to do is go ahead and add this to Plex. So we're going to go back into Plex, and I'm going to pop open to my ZimaBoard section right over here. And what we've got over here is I'm going to go ahead and now add that library. For this one, it is just a general one. Where is my library? Right here. So I'm just going to add in other videos. And now we should be able to map to it. So it's under root, MNT, Plex Media, and if you see a folder in there or anything, you know you're good. And so now we should see this. So let's go ahead and just play this thing. So we'll see that we've got the exact same stuff mapped in both places. So up here is actually directly I installed Plex on my DS923 Plus that's running this. And it's got the same CPU as this DS1522 Plus. So they should perform identically, poorly because they do not have hardware transcoding. And once we give this a second to actually figure out everything that's on in there, we will also be able to go ahead and play this right off of it and see what kind of performance we get. So the one that absolutely destroyed it is the one for YouTube. I could not get this thing to play off the DS923 Plus at all. And let's go ahead and just try it out. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play. This is playing off the ZimaBoard. And this is what I upload to YouTube. And you can see it's an insanely high megabit rate. I basically just give YouTube as much information as possible in the hopes that when they compress it, hopefully it'll be better. So I'm going back to convert maximum, and I'm going to hit play on this and see if we can play back real time. Now this is going to be tough for it because, as you saw, it's massive file size. And the way to tell is this bar right there is telling us if it is increasing, that means it's actually going to be able to play it back for good. And it seems like it may be staying steady state. We're probably hitting right at the maximum of this ZimaBoard right now. And we can also check and see that it is in fact hardware transcoding by coming into our dashboard. And right here we can see that it is using hardware transcoding, which is the only reason why this CPU is able to handle this. So we can see that buffer has stayed out through the entire time. Let's go to that exact same video, now hosted on the actual DS923 Plus. And we're going to see a very different experience. So this is it playing directly off the DS923 Plus. Convert maximum, exact same settings. We can see that our CPU is completely pinned, and we are not going to be able to successfully get up there. So if you look, Plex is going to be choppy playback. Yep, there's choppy playback. It is unable to keep up. That is because it is not able to use the hardware transcoding. So now maybe we even drop this down to something simpler like, let's just go 720p medium. You can see it's just taken a ton of time to do all of this because even this, and you can see how poor this video quality is still having to take this absurdly massive file and downsample it. It is really struggling here still. It looks like it's going to be able to do it, but just barely. If we look at some more reasonable stuff where I actually kind of did a couple of other compressions here that should help. So this one was generated in, let's go to the 1080p one. I think that should be the most reasonable one. I basically generated the same video in a lot of different formats. Basically, I've got two files here that are 1080p. So now we're going to try a much more reasonable 1080p file with this. First, we're going to try it on the DS923 Plus directly. All right, and it's playing original. We do need to transcode it to show this difference, but that is one good thing to know. If you're never transcoding and you're direct playing everything, it's not that much of a help other than CPU offloading and some stuff like that, but it's going to be pretty negligible overall. But let's go ahead and just transcode this for the sake of this demonstration. All right, so I'm transcoding a 1080p file, and the DS923 Plus does appear to be able to handle it itself. It is transcoding 1080 to 1080. Though if we do look over here, our CPU is pinned to 100%. So now let's go ahead and just look at that exact same file on the Zima board. And we're going to upscale it in the exact same way, or transcode it in this case in the exact same way. We can see it is still able to handle it. We look at the Zima board dashboard. Our system, Plex, is not using a massive amount of resources anymore because we are hardware transcoding this thing. It makes it much easier. We would be able to support much more streams on Linux and Windows, and we're using Linux right now. There's no appreciable upper limit on how many streams you can do, at least from a technical limitation. It's all going to be based off the performance of your GPU transcoding. So just right there, we do have the ability, and you can just see there are times where this is super valuable and times that it's not. But one real advantage is right now we are transcoding this thing. And if we look at our DS923, it's got no CPU usage because the actual Zima board right here is offloading all of that responsibility. All right, well, that's gonna be it. We have now just set up your Plex media server on your Zima board, and now you have access to all your media right on there. Thanks to Zima board for sponsoring this tutorial. If you have any other questions, leave them down in the comments below. One last thing I'm going to recommend doing is right now it's got the default username of CasaOS and default password of CasaOS. I would recommend changing those, as well as logging into actual CasaOS, which I didn't even get to, which is kind of like a Synology interface. I would recommend logging in here, and when you log in for the very first time, you also get prompted to change your password. I would just recommend those two things. If this is just a lab environment, and if somebody from your local network wants to mess with it, it's not a big of a deal. It is just very good practice to get into. And this is now also an isolated system off of our NAS. So even if Plex does have vulnerability detected in it, it does not have direct access to the NAS like it would if you had a vulnerability within Synology, DSM, and Plex. Though ever since DSM 7.0, which broke Plex for a lot of people, that has gotten even further isolated. All right, well, that's it. Go ahead and leave any other questions you got for me down in the comments below, and have a good one. Bye.